Good afternoon, everyone. It's now 2 p.m. This is the February 25th work session of the Portland City Council. Before I turn this over to the Office of Management and Finance to lead us through today's work session, I just wanted to offer a few opening remarks. First of all, this is a conversation that I'm sure you're aware has been in the works for quite some time. The procurement services team began evaluating the city's social equity and contracting programs in the fall of 2019, and they started planning for this work session towards the end of last year. And as you'll recall from our early discussions as a council, I know that we collectively share a goal of using city purchasing to improve economic prosperity, as well as increasing participation from women and minority-owned firms and diverse workforces on all city projects. We're doing a lot better than we were even just a few years ago, but we obviously have opportunities to improve and a responsibility to stay focused. Progress is going to require greater collaboration, and today's a chance for us to commit to that collaboration. Each of us as individual bureau leaders, our contracting community, and our other public partners all have a role to play in this important effort. This is a dense topic. We won't cover everything today. My goal for today's session is to build a shared understanding of our programs and our policies, where they're succeeding and where frankly they aren't, and how we can support our directors, our procurement experts, and all of our partners to improve. So we'll begin by turning this over to our Chief Financial Officer, Michelle Kirby, to get us started. Michelle, take it away.
Thank you, Mayor, and good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you, our City Council Commissioners, and our audience members. For the record, I'm Michelle Kirby. I'm the city's Chief Financial Officer and the Director of the Bureau of Revenue and Financial Services. We are excited to engage with you today in this vitally important discussion regarding the city's social equity and contracting policies. These contracting programs and policies exist because the city recognizes that our nation's history of racism and sexism has provided unfair advantages to white male entrepreneurs and has simultaneously created additional burdens on entrepreneurs of color and women entrepreneurs. The city has been part of that system that produced the inequities, which means that we have the opportunity and the responsibility to change. Through our social equity in contracting programs and policies, the city aims to fairly award contracts, generate equitable economic opportunity, and improve procurement options through increased competition among high-quality contractors and consultants. Together, we face the challenge of achieving program outcomes consistent with our core values of anti-racism, equity, and fiscal responsibility, while operating in a legal environment that strictly limits targeted race-conscious programs and goals. But the City Council and the community want transformative change and significant improved outcome. These programs we have in place date back over 30 years and apply to varying degrees to our three major categories of contracting. And those are construction, professional services, and goods and services. Over the past 2 years, members of City Council have shined a spotlight on procurement services. The city auditor published an audit that the city procurement process, despite meeting or exceeding most established equity contracting goals, had some multiple significant issues. And we agree with many of these underlying concerns and share the commitment to achieving equitable outcomes. But procurement services has felt constrained in its ability to achieve this degree of change, partly because legal precedent and local statutes limit our options, partly because, like the rest of the city, our resources are constrained, but also very importantly, because we do not own the entire procurement process. In the city's decentralized model, procurement services and bureaus each have significant ownership of different parts of the procurement process. And so it is our hope that this work session will start a fresh chapter for our social equity and contracting programs, one that brings council, procurement, bureaus, and our community advisors to the table, that is informed by data and our legal framework, that is cognizant of the resources, roles, and trade-offs, that creates a shared understanding of where our programs are achieving goals and where they need to improve, and that sets us on a path forward together. As we will discuss today, there are many opportunities to improve and expand the programs to further reduce barriers and improve the outcomes of our social equity and contracting programs and policies. Overall, we need your feedback regarding the direction the city should move in social equity in contracting programs. But 3 of you are new to the council, and we feel it's important to spend a small amount of time ensuring you feel grounded before diving into big policy questions. So our goals for today are: number 1, establish an understanding of the history, legal, and policy framework and established goals of our current city social equity and contracting programs. 2, we will establish a shared perspective of the successes and effectiveness of these programs, of the opportunities that exist for improving and expanding our programs, and the challenges that exist to achieving more equitable outcomes. 3, we will begin to establish support for a collaborative, coordinated, and funded approach. And 4, we will gain direction and support to move forward with short-term actions to improve existing programs, and then longer-term development of a plan to refresh and revitalize our social equity and contracting programs. But before we move on, I'd like to quickly acknowledge the recent equity and construction contracting audit. Procurement is taking this seriously and has begun addressing the issues and concerns that were raised, and we will be publishing progress reports on a regular basis. But that said, the focus of today's session is broader. That audit focused solely on construction, and today's major procurement types, the programs that do and don't exist, outcomes, legal framework, best practices, and plans for moving forward. So you can see we have a lot to do today. We have a robust agenda. There's lots to cover in limited time. So our plan is that at the end of each of these sections, we take a few minutes to answer clarifying questions. And I'm going to function as the facilitator. And so I'll be monitoring the chat as well as raised hands if you have a clarifying question that we'll address at the end of each section. Most of these sections are going to be fairly short in length, and we wish to save time at the end of the presentation for a robust discussion and reflection. So I will also, in my role as a facilitator, be doing my best to keep us on track with time. And with that, I'd like to briefly introduce the people who will be presenting to you today. For items 1 and 2, Kathleen Bredes-Marua, our interim chief procurement officer, will be presenting. For number 3, we have Colette Holt, a nationally recognized expert in procurement and contracting. Ms. Holt recently completed a disparity study for the Port of Portland, and we feel fortunate to benefit from the perspective she brings to our conversation today. Number 4, Kathleen Massier, our city compliance program manager. Number 5, Judith Mowry, Office of Equity and Human Rights Senior Policy Advisor, will be joined by Connie Ashbrook, a consultant and community advisor for the Community Equity and Inclusion Committee. Connie is also a regular attendee and contributor to the Fair Contracting Forum. Also, Art Cortez, a contractor and community advisor from the Community Equity and Inclusion Committee, and Nate McCoy, a member of the Fair Contracting Forum and executive director of NAMAC. And finally, in our sixth section, moving forward, we have Tom Reinhardt, our CAO, who will facilitate the final section and the conversation. And so with that, we're ready to move into the background and history. So I'll be watching, and I'll pop in at the end of this section to ask for clarifying questions. But in the meanwhile, I'll turn it over to Kathleen Brenes-Morua. Kathleen?
Thanks, Michelle. Good afternoon, Mayor and Commissioners. I'm Kathleen Brenes-Morua, Interim Chief Procurement Officer. As Michelle stated, next slide, please. As Michelle stated, the city has had social equity and contracting programs for over 30 years, mostly concentrated in construction contracting. These programs were most recently refreshed in 2012 to update policies and improve the outcomes in 3 key areas. In workforce, our workforce programs aim to increase apprenticeship and journey level opportunities in the construction trades for people of color and women. In subcontracting, our subcontracting programs aim to increase utilization of firms certified by the state's Certification Office for Business Inclusion and Diversity, hereafter referred to by the acronym COBID, with specific aspirational goals for firms owned by people of color and women. And also in prime contracting. Our prime contracting programs aim to increase utilization and capacity of COBID certified prime contractors by limiting competition and providing technical assistance and business development support. Next slide, please. Procurement Services is a division of the Bureau of Revenue and Financial Services within the Office of Management and Finance. Over the years, we've had the challenging dual mission of 1, to procure the goods and services needed by all city bureaus to efficiently meet their operating needs, and for the provision of services to the Portland community as a whole. And 2, to develop and administer equity programs to create a more inclusive environment by creating opportunities for businesses owned by people of color and women to participate in city procurement and contracting processes. Next slide. There are 5 major phases in the procurement process. It begins with determining and defining the need to then solicit for the goods or services. Once bids and proposals are received, they are evaluated for responsiveness and compliance with the solicitation requirements, and to determine the successful bidder or proposer. We then enter into negotiations as appropriate to enter into the contractual agreement. This process is substantially decentralized, as the next slide will highlight. In this slide, there's a lot of information, but what we hope to demonstrate is that there, in the different points in the procurement process, there are different decision makers at each point in the process. And it also demonstrates where the city can promote equitable outcomes in those different phases. In our decentralized environment, both procurement and bureaus have a significant opportunity to influence the process to achieve more equitable outcomes. So over the last 30 years, there have been many milestones in our social equity and contracting programs. We've conducted 2 disparity studies, There have been 4 different audits. After those audits, we've taken those recommendations to further improve and develop programs. We currently have 12 social equity and contracting programs of differing sizes that are administered by procurement services. And the city has adopted 3 resolutions establishing and expanding social equity and contracting programs and priorities.
Okay, I told you this was going to move along at a relatively swift pace. And so we're at the end of section 1. I do not see any raised hands. I do not see any questions in chat. Oh, Commissioner Hardesty, please ask your question.
Thank you. I was going to wait till the end, but if we're leaving the history, there have been 4 audit reports since 2001, as was reflected in the last slide. And I'm curious if you can also tell me where we saw improvement between 2001 and 2020.
So in our next session, when we're looking at the performance indicators, we will have data to show over the years where we've had incremental successes or results. And I think that will address your question.
Okay, thank you. I will wait.
Commissioner Ryan.
Yes, thank you. I do have a question on the last slide where it showed all the programs. Could you go back to that?
Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm sure I'm not the only one. If someone said, Commissioner Ryan, please tell me what these 12 programs mean, I couldn't do that. Is there a way for people tuning in to know what these acronyms mean?
Allow me to run through them.
And if this is going to be explained later, I'll wait. I just, it seems like this is a big deal to know what these 12 current programs are.
Absolutely. And apologies, and kind of the intent to make sure that we have enough time to cover everything. I skipped over this important piece of identifying all the various programs we do have. So WTHP is the Workforce Training and Hiring Program. This program applies to our low bid construction contracts. The SEP is the Subcontractor Equity Program. And this also applies to our low bid construction projects. The workforce program aims to increase opportunities for women and people of color in apprenticeship and journey level trades. And then the subcontractor equity program aims to increase the utilization of minority owned people of color and women subcontracting opportunities on our projects. CEIP is the acronym for the Community Equity and Inclusion Plan. The Community Equity Inclusion Plan, along with the CBA, which is the Community Benefits Agreement, and then the DEIP, which is the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Plan, are comprehensive plans that apply to our alternative construction contracts, like construction manager, general contract, or design build contracts. These plans incorporate both goals, aspirational goals for workforce, increasing workforce opportunities and subcontracting opportunities as well, and also touch upon mentoring and other aspects of improving the environment for women and people of color on our projects. The CEOP is the Community Opportunities Equity Program. This is where 1% of the construction contract value for those contracts exceeding $500,000 are set aside for technical assistance programs. The Community Opportunities Equity Programs are currently being administered by Prosper Portland, or I should say the funding and provision of technical assistance is being handled by Prosper Portland. JOC is Job Order Contracting. It's a new program under construction services that allows us to provide numerous opportunities to COVID certified firms by having them on kind of like, a master agreement where when services are identified, we can quickly, through job orders, have them come out, scope the project, bid on the project, and obtain the work. PTE stands for our Professional, Technical, and Expert Services contracts, where we have aspirational goals to increase sub-consulting opportunities, again, for people of color and women. And then our goods and services contracts, we are currently looking at opportunities as well. We haven't historically had aspirational goals, but we're extending those opportunities to our goods and services contracts. And under both goods and services and our professional, technical, and expert contracts, we've implemented direct contracting policy where we are able to, without competing, go directly and award contracts to COVID certified firms for contracts up to $150,000. And then our MEP is the Minority Evaluator Program, where we seek volunteers, community members, to participate in the evaluation and award of our contracts.
All right. Thank you, Kathleen. Take a drink of water now. Good job of knowing all that off the top of your head. And
there's also a document's been loaded into the chat that gives a brief summary if anybody'd like a written copy.
Exactly. And it also is on the procurement website. Commissioner Hardesty, did you have another clarifying question?
Yes, thank you. In all these programs, where did all these programs live? Do they all live in procurement?
All of these programs live in procurement. They were developed and are being administered within procurement services. However, bureaus have also accountability and responsibility to ensure that as they are managing the contracts, that the contractors on those contracts are complying with the requirements. So it's a shared responsibility then at that point.
Thank you for that. Let me just say that one problem is there are way too many programs and
Yes, duly noted. Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty.
And Commissioner Ryan, if I can just say thank you for asking the question and giving me the opportunity to run through the various programs and what they mean.
No, I was impressed that you had them all in your head and you could tell them to me. And I'm sorry for not being muted and expressing myself a bit with my audible, but it is something I think we have to look at because like Commissioner Hardesty said, there's so many programs here, and there is a tendency to, say this line, which is program rich and system poor. And so you're kind of trying to figure out where the impact is with all these programs for a later date, I'm sure. But I think it's good to pause here just to notice this fascinating visual. Thank you.
Well, you provided the perfect segue, Commissioner Ryan, because our next section is about program performance indicators, so we can start to see which ones are effective or not. So Kathleen, are you ready to move along?
I am ready to move along. Yeah.
Okay. You have 15 minutes or less.
Okay. And I may be running through these rather quickly. So again, and I see that Commissioner Mouse has a question. So before we move on, you're muted.
I know I'm going to have a question on this slide, but I can take it at the end of the presentation. My hand is just up.
Okay, perfect. I didn't know if it was for the previous section, so I will continue. So we have, our programs fall primarily into three categories. Within our construction contracting activities, professional services, and goods and services. We commit substantial resources each year under each of these categories. As you can see, we've provided an average annual volume of spend and also the resulting number of contracts and on average for any given year. We've got many programs, as we've just discussed, and I previewed for you in the last slide, to, again, largely concentrated in construction, a few in professional services for, again, trying to increase the number of minority-owned and women-owned sub-consultants on our projects, but not just in sub-consulting, but also in growing their capacity to actually be able to compete for prime contracting opportunities. And then we're just starting in goods and services to look for those opportunities where, again, and realizing that there are certified firms as well where we can tap into through direct contracting and other means to achieve results. In those programs for construction, we've got 5 compliance staff that monitor contractors' compliance. Contractors are reporting monthly, and so we've got compliance staff to monitor those activities. For professional services, currently we've got 1 compliance specialist assigned, and currently we do not have any compliance specialists providing that monitoring on the goods and services side. So as you can see, the dedicated staffing levels are relatively modest. And this is, does not account for any of staff within the bureaus that are and can be performing similar functions. Next slide, please. So we start to look at kind of data, and we want to, as we move forward, to use the data that we have to inform decisions as we look to see where our programs are achieving some results and where we can focus more efforts to improve on the outcomes. This first slide here is looking directly at construction prime contracts, at the contract dollars awarded. And if you can see through the years, and this takes a look at the past 10 years, there has been incremental increases in the dollars being awarded to businesses owned by people of color and women in our construction contracts as prime contractors. The slide beside it shows, there's a bar graph, and the slide beside it shows kind of based on percentage. Also the same data of, again, where our people of color contractors and women are coming in the last fiscal years. So the trend is upward for both. As you can see, firms owned by people of color, those owned by white women. But that said, the trend for people of color is more consistently, has been more consistently upward than the trend for women-owned firms. However, while we've achieved some success, we recognize that there is opportunity to do better.
Kathleen?
Next slide. Yes.
I'm going to interrupt, and Commissioner Hardesty asked a question. If you could go back to the previous slide, Jenny. Without a demographic breakdown, there's no way to tell who's benefiting from the public dollars. Commissioner Hardesty,
and we will
clarify that, please.
Well, I mean, to just say people of color, who are you talking about? Because my experience has been that especially with construction contracts, it is rare for an African-American male to get a construction contract with the city of Portland. And so what my experience says that when we lump everybody together, we don't know who benefits and who doesn't. So I need to know how many African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans. Just telling me people of color doesn't paint the real picture of who benefits from city contracts and who doesn't.
Point taken, and that is data that we can provide. We don't have a slide specifically with that breakdown for all of this.
That you don't have that slide today because we've asked those consistent questions over the last 2 years. So I'm surprised that you would have this presentation without having complete data.
Okay, well, that's something we can provide in a follow-up messaging. Commissioner Mapps, do you want to ask your question now while we're?
No, actually, I'd like to wait till the end of the
All right.
this section.
Okay.
All right, so this next slide, we're looking at the workforce. These graphs describe the outcomes, again, for people of color and for white women who comprise the construction workforce on our capital improvement projects. The first graph shows the utilization trend for men of color. It's steadily increased over the past decade. And for white women, the trend is relatively flat. For women of color, the utilization has increased, again, relatively flat, but has shown, an increase from 2 to 3%, which again, it's both modest, but also significant in that it represents doubling of the hours worked by women of color over the past 10 years. The second graph describes how these three demographic groups are represented in the city's top 2 trades over the past 3 years. So for laborers and power equipment operators, represent half of the hours on city construction projects during this period. As you can see, men of color, women of color, and white women are represented substantially higher in the lower compensated laborer trade than the higher compensated power equipment operator trade. So in this slide, again, we want to use this data to, determine benchmarking, appropriate benchmarking and goal setting as we move forward. Next slide, please. We also wanted to provide you a snapshot of our professional services prime contracts, similar to the construction services prime contracts over the 10 years. Past 10 years, we have seen, again, incremental increases in the dollars being awarded to firms owned by people of color and firms owned by white women. And I do want to make a distinction that we did break out the data to show businesses can be certified in various categories. One, for their status as a business of color, and another for the status as women. So we did want to make, when we're looking at the data, we make that distinction and capture all firms owned by people of color regardless of gender, and then specifically for white women. So on the professional services side, we haven't had our programs have primarily aimed to increase the consulting opportunities, both at the sub-consultant level and as the prime consultant level. And as you can see, again, our programs have had some success. The first table, again, shows a positive trend in the dollars awarded. And then, the increase is seen over the past 3 fiscal years. If we look at it, I think that what we are seeing is In the last several years, we've been more intentional in looking for ways to increase opportunities through our price agreement and on-call services type contracts. The second table also shows a generally positive trend in the percentage of the total professional services award for both groups. Next slide.
Before you leave that slide, please.
Yes.
There was a significant increase in contracted awards in fiscal year 18 and a significant decrease in fiscal year 19. I think it's an overstatement to say we're doing better. We did something better in 1 year and then we dropped off. Can you talk a bit more about why that big decline, what happened, and what are you doing to fix it?
So each fiscal year, dependent on the projects that are let, the needs that are let, I would say in the professional services side, in 2018, we have to look at the projects that were let at that time. The Portland building was one of those projects that provided for many more opportunities. But we also have, during that time, incorporated direct contracting policies where, again, we can, without having to compete those opportunities, award contracts directly to co-bid certified firms. So what you're seeing from, the difference between fiscal year 18, 19, and 20, part of it has to do with the projects that we had at that time.
I just want to say your slides aren't that helpful if I can't track it back to who's actually receiving contracts in the context under which we're talking about these global issues. I've read the audits. I was around when we did the disparity studies. And I feel like we're just talking as if we're doing okay with these incremental changes. So I just want you to know I'm feeling a bit frustrated because I feel like I'm not getting the information for me to be able to make a good decision at the end of this presentation.
And I appreciate your comments, Commissioner Hardesty, and apologize that the data being presented isn't as comprehensive as it should be. And we're not, I want to assure you that we're not wanting to make a statement today that we have been, successful. What we want to do is more provide awareness of where we were 10 years ago, where we are today. We want to use this data to help us inform how we can do better. And so, again, I just want to assure you, we're not resting on our laurels here, and we will look deeper at the data and we'll provide you the disaggregated data and more comprehensive explanation as we move forward.
And I would just like to take a quick moment to interject that there's a lot of detail that we're trying to convey in a relatively short period of time here. So we did take it up to a more summary level. We're trying to provide a bit of context to the newer commissioners, but without diving into each and every project in each and every year. So the data certainly is available, like Kathleen indicated, but we didn't want to dwell too much on this part because it's so data heavy.
And the only way my colleagues are going to have enough information for us to have a collective vision is if they have all the information, not just the high level. We're never going to be able to help us be better if we don't have all the information we need to make an informed decision. I'll stop there, continue. I just want you to know I'm very frustrated because we've had these conversations over 2 years. And so to come in and not have detailed demographic information and to be talking about our success when clearly we are not enjoying success and making these opportunities available for women and people of color business owners. So I will stop there.
All right.
Go ahead.
I will continue. And just want to say I do appreciate those comments, Commissioner Hardesty. And next, we wanted to take a look at the goods and services prime contracts. Again, we haven't really extended our programs or opportunities within those procurements previously. We started to do so incrementally, adding requirements in our procurements back in 2016. So we've got some data to show with the efforts that we've made to, again, look for those opportunities within our goods and general services type contracting. Where can we get more participation from both businesses owned by people of color and women? We have seen, again, that there are opportunities, and this is an area where we need to really explore and do better in.
Can I ask a clarifying question here, Kathleen?
Absolutely.
So just so I understand what's happening on the slide on the right, what exactly do these lines represent? So you have your line chart. Yeah.
Right. For the various fiscal years here, we are showing that we have awarded, for example, in fiscal year 16, a little over $4 million in contracts to people of color or women. In fiscal year 17, about 14 million. So this is of the city's overall spend. And in fiscal year 18, again, about 14 million. Fiscal year 19, we were down, it dropped to about 4 million. In fiscal year 20, where he came in at about, 7.5 to 8 million. In the previous first slide, we showed that in any given time period for the goods and services, the spend is approximately 295 million.
Okay.
So what we hope to show is, the dollars that have been going to businesses of color and women.
I think you're, and I apologize. I think I was less. I could have been clearer on that. I'm interested in the other slide here, the line chart. So when we say
the percentage
of total contract value and the percentage of total contracts, I'm trying to get some just intuition about what these lines are telling me or showing me.
So again, it's against the total spend for goods and services. So in the percentage of total award, it's just a different way of showing that we've spent over the years, approximately, 4.5%, 5% of the city spend in goods and services has been, so in fiscal year 20, for example, have been to firms of color
Right.
and women.
And the green,
and it's just two, and the green bars is to show the actual dollars that were awarded to those firms.
right. So the gray line is showing us the percentage of, the gray line is telling us about money, the absolute amount of money that got spent expressed as a percentage of total awards. And the dark green line is showing us the total number of contracts. So for example, I think that we probably had about 769 goods and services contracts. And so is that showing us in 2020 about 4.5% of that 769%? That's what that is. Am I reading these lines correctly?
And I am going to ask just to make sure that I'm stating it correctly, our data expert, Paul Stewart, could you confirm Commissioner Mapp's understanding?
Yes, I think you're understanding it accurately. The gray line describes the percentage of total dollars awarded, and then the darker line, the dark green, is describing the percentage of individual contracts awarded.
Thanks, Paul.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Paul. All right, we will move on to the next slide.
Yeah, Kathleen.
Yes,
Is
we're at time.
as we can go. Yeah, I know.
We
there's-
are beyond time.
Move ahead.
All right, so I'll try to quickly run through these slides. But again, we just wanted to demonstrate overall how the subcontracting programs are doing, how the workforce programs are doing with the various goals that we have set and what they have achieved. Next slide. We also wanted to, use the data and take a look at how other public agencies nationally are doing in this space. And so we've taken both look at the prime and subcontracting programs and payments made to contractors of color and women-owned firms in the city of Austin, city of Seattle, and city of Portland. And also with the workforce program hours, looking at Seattle's priority hiring program in comparison to our own program to show, how we compare on a national register to other similar programs. In this particular side, we were able and have shown by race and ethnicity the percentages that of the workforce program hours going to African American individuals, Asian, Latino, Native American, white, all people, and then also collectively all people of color, and then all women. Next slide, please.
Commissioner Mapps, did you want to ask your question here?
No, why don't we get through the section and then I'll just ask my question.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Kathleen.
Commissioner Ryan, do you have a question on the prior slide?
Yeah, I think if I could ask this question right, if you go back, it might help anyone that's looking. So when you look at the city of Seattle and look at the city of Portland, I'll try to find an extreme example. So when I'm on the left side, I'm getting kind of like prideful, like that's not bad. Then I go over to the right side, not so much. And it kind of pops out a couple times, of course. Are you following me? Like when it says firms owned by white women, for example, or says 20, and there's 7% of all payments. So why are the workforce program hours so different? Like I would assume that when I look at this one, that we wouldn't be 3 percentage points lower since we were 13 points higher on the firms owned by white women, for example, just to paint one.
Right.
So help my brain understand why there's these two don't intuitively match up very well. And I must have a block somewhere and I don't know where it is.
So overall, when we're looking on, there's a difference between the subcontracting and contracting opportunities and dollars being awarded. And then on the workforce side, the labor hours and the people of color and women that are getting opportunities to provide labor on those projects. So we can't compare too much. And if I'm following correctly with the combined prime and subcontractor payments, that's just showing the dollars that are actually going either through, through all the various contracting opportunities, whether prime or subcontracting, to firms owned by white women or by people of color. The workforce program slide with, the blue column headings, it's just specifically looking at Seattle's priority hiring program in comparison with the various workforce programs that the city has, and how they are doing in actually providing opportunities, labor opportunities on our projects. Does that answer the question, or did I not?
Well, I'm doing the best I can with it. I think what my brain did at first was maybe there's some owners of the company that might be of color women, but then the workers don't match up. And so where in Seattle, they might have more workers of color, but maybe I'm trying to read something into it, and I'm struggling to try to make a comparison. I apologize, colleagues, that I had to come back to this. It wasn't sinking in. So.
It may also have something to do with the size of the contracts, because when I look at firms owned by people of color, 11% seems excessively high. And it may just be because there are a couple of African-American owned firms who finally are prime contractors, and they have received significant contracts. So I'm not believing that we're doing better than Seattle or Austin based on what we know to be true here at the city of Portland. So I don't take that at face value. I think there may be a lot of other factors involved. And for me, it might be just the size of the contract, that that now they're a big company, but if we're only using 2, we're still not utilizing every one that we have. So I would take it with a grain of salt.
Commissioner Mapps?
I'm going to wait for us to get to the end of this presentation.
Okay. Gotcha. And Commissioner Rubio?
Hi, Commissioner, you're muted.
Thank you. The comment that Commissioner Hardesty just raised was my actual question. I was curious about a percentage of what total aggregate number, so that we could actually see like the disaggregation of like by community about what size of contracts are going where, to understand where that impact is. And yeah, across all of the professional services and construction as well. Yeah, that was my question. Is it possible to get an idea?
So, Paul, do we have data on that? It's definitely something that we can get back to Commissioner Rubio and Commissioner Hardesty, and again, provide more detail into the data being provided or shown here today.
We have something we can put on screen. Just got to give Jenny a minute or two to queue it up.
Well, are we going to put it on the screen or provide it later?
Michelle's trying to keep us on that tight timeline because there's a lot to cover. And if I could ask, and I think Michelle is asking as well, if we can return to you all with this information, and if there's time at the end of the presentation.
Okay.
If we can get it up quickly, let's do it now. And that's not it.
I'm fine waiting till the end or follow up, whatever time allows.
Thank you, Commissioner Rubio.
This is Paul. I'll just connect with Jenny offline while you proceed.
Kathleen and Michelle, can I make a suggestion? This is Tom. What about if we're caught up in my section, we could take a couple minutes before the moving forward, and Paul could send me a slide to put up so we can satisfy commissioners' questions at the end. Is that an acceptable way to go forward so we can answer that? Let's do that.
Yeah. Okay, Paul, did you get that?
Should we slide that slide in at the end?
Yeah, why don't you slide it in right before my moving forward section so we can we can settle some of the questions around disaggregated data before we do that section of the agenda.
All right, sounds good.
Commissioner Ryan, did you have a question?
Oh, well, I think I just want you to know where my brain landed with this conversation. And I think that's why we will need follow-up information. My sense is that we have minority-owned companies that lack the diversity that we'd like to see, and of course, majority companies as well. So it really was helpful that you had the workforce hours slide, and I'm glad you had that presented. And I think that the contrast is what's fascinating to is what we have to dig into more. And that's what I'm taking away from that. And so I just wanted to say that. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. So this last slide that we wanted to show you again, kind of as a performance indicator. And again, the reason for providing the information or these snapshots is to take a look at where City of Portland stands against some other agencies. Not again to say that these are, the best results that we can receive, but just again, how we can use the data that we've collected over the past 10 years to revisit all of our programs and to identify those areas and to get at the, the information and the granular detail to where we focus our efforts moving forward. So looking at the Portland building and the county courthouse, again, just a comparison, right, of the percentage of dollars that were spent or paid to firms owned by people of color versus white women-owned firms. On the workforce side, the percentage of hours that were performed by men of color versus women of color or white women, and then showing the total apprentice hours for both those projects. While these two projects are similar, I do want to point out that the Portland building was a major renovation, right, of an existing structure, while the county courthouse was brand new construction. So while both were, the value of both projects were comparable, because of the type of construction, there are more opportunities in brand new construction, different types of trades, different types of, firms that were needed in comparison to the renovation of the Portland building project. So that is the difference that you're seeing in the amount of workforce hours for the Portland building renovation. There's, some of those dollars, spend were on materials and equipment. And so again, the difference in the hours is because of one, Portland building was this major renovation of an existing structure, while the county courthouse was from the ground up.
And we have a question in the chat regarding women of color. Are they counted twice, Kathleen?
The women of color in this particular slide, or this is specific to the workforce hours, so they are not counted twice.
Okay, thank you.
So, yes.
And Commissioner Mepps, this is the last slide of this section. Are you ready to ask your question?
Absolutely. First, I want to thank staff for their presentation today. There's a lot of information here. I find it very helpful, and I know it's complicated, and I know we're on a tight timeline too. But I would like to revisit the slide on programs and indicators. It might be slide number 12 in today's presentation. Programs and indicators. Okay, great. Thank you. A couple of things strike me here, and I'm going to want to take a look at another slide to juxtapose in a second. So we have three types of procurement: construction, professional services, goods and services. I'm contrasting that with how much money is in each of these pots. By far the biggest pot is goods and services with nearly 300 million in there. And then I'm juxtaposing that with our staffing levels. And then kind of mysteriously to me, construction is half the size of goods and services, but it has 5 staff who are kind of working the equity angle here. On the other hand, when we get to goods and services, which is $300 million and 700 and some odd contracts, we have no FTEs. That causes me some concern. And then I'd like to move forward and juxtapose that with slide number 16, which shows us the performance for goods and services. Could we go forward to that one? Okay, let's focus in on the slide on the right, which shows us the percentage of total awards. Here, the reason why I was asking what the slide means is that it's a little bit confusing. I want to, number one, first take a note of the scale here. And most of the other line graphs we saw, the scale kind of goes from 0 to like 30%. Here, we're looking at a very kind of tightly zoomed in scale where we're just looking at 0 to 7%. And then let's take a look at the grayish line, the total contract value, which means of all the money that we spend, which is a ton on goods and services, about 300 million a year. We're spending a very tiny percentage of that on women, on people of color and businesses owned by women. All of which kind of tells me, on our biggest pot and our biggest opportunity, we have no staffing there. And frankly, we seem to be doing bad, both in terms of the trends and in terms of the absolute number of dollars that we got out the door. I don't quite know what to do with that, but that's something which really jumps out at me, and I'd encourage my colleagues to, I'd like to have a conversation with my colleagues about that. If staff want to jump in here now, that's fine, or if we want to save this conversation to the end of the presentation, that's fine too. Well,
it's certainly noted as an area that we need to make improvement, that there's opportunity for improvement. We fully recognize that.
Do we have any sense of why there's just 0 people? Go ahead, Kathleen, go ahead.
Yeah, if I can provide just some brief context here. Going back to that program and indicator slide, what you're seeing there within construction, again, that is where the city historically has focused all of its equity in contracting programs. So that third column, there are, in construction alone, about 8 different programs that apply. Part of that is because of the availability of one on the workforce side, or the goals on the workforce side, right? To get more people of color and women in apprenticeship and journey level opportunities on our programs, but also on the contracting side, contractors. There are, I would say, in the construction industry, more opportunities for contractors of color and women to perform work on our programs.
Sure.
And that is why we've got 5 staff members to provide that monitoring of compliance for all of those programs. Whereas in goods and services, we haven't had those programs. And therefore, we haven't had compliance staff because there hasn't been anything to monitor, right, compliance when any of the requirements. And what you're seeing with the amount of spend, it's the pool of contractors, let's say, or the industry is structured differently in that there aren't certified firms that are, providing goods. And when you think about goods and the spend, we are, talking about fire trucks, and we're talking about vehicles for our fleet. All of that rolls up into the goods and services spend. So it's not just, office supplies, but we're also talking about, the pump stations, the equipment, and all of the materials that go into that, and why the value is so much higher. And again, in that industry, there aren't that many certified firms that are able to provide the type of goods that we need to operate.
Thank you, Kathleen. I appreciate that clarification. And here, I'm not going to talk to you, but rather I'm going to kind of direct my message to the rest of my members of council. This strikes me as being a real area of opportunity. This is where we spend most of our money. This is where we have the most of our contracts. We have no staffing here. And that 300 million, we seem to sort of get about, 1% out to businesses that are operated by women of color or women or people of color. I'm not saying that we're doing a bad job here, although it kind of looks like we're doing a bad job here. But what I am saying is this looks like a real opportunity where we could, I hope there's some low-hanging fruit here, especially if we invested in some new programs and maybe some staff to make sure that we get it done.
And that's a good segue into our next presenter and topics that she will cover.
You're taking my role. Yes, thank you. I know this is a lot to digest at one time. We have the good fortune of having a national expert in this area, Colette Holt from Holt and Associates. And she is here today. There she is, okay. And I will now turn it over to you, and she's going to discuss the legal framework and the opportunities to make improvements. Thank you, Colette.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and hopefully you can all hear me fine. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you this afternoon. And I will try to be brief, help to get us back on the schedule. But I wanted to start by making sure that we were all using terms in more or less the same way, because that also helps to advance the conversation and to assist council and the community to come together about cohesive policies. So I wanted to at least first define what a disparity study is. You hear that term a lot. The city of Portland has had a couple of disparity studies over the years. And as was mentioned, we did the study for the Port of Portland, I guess almost 2 years ago now. But a study really is a quantitative and a qualitative research project that's designed to answer a couple of questions, one of which, and perhaps most importantly, is to meet whatever the legal standard is that the federal courts require for a race and gender conscious program. And that requires us to take a look at both statistical data of the agency's utilization of minority and women-owned firms, the availability of those firms, and to see how tight the fit is between who is utilized and who is available and whether or not there is a quote-unquote disparity. People often use that term in a fairly loose colloquial sense, and that's fine. But when I'm talking about a disparity study, it really is a statistical and anecdotal evaluation designed to meet the legal standards, which I'll get to in just a second. By race-conscious policies, and that also includes gender, it just makes the slides shorter. Those are policies that directly take race or gender into account in contracting decision-making, primarily through the use of contract goals. And race-neutral policies are policies that benefit all small firms. And I think we have some slides about that in a second. Things like ensuring that the agency pays promptly, unbundling contracts where possible, reducing experience requirements, those kinds of initiatives or focus that can really help all firms to succeed in getting city contracts. Next slide, please. So I want to spend just a minute on the program standards and try not to be too legalistic or jargony, but it is really important that everyone understand how hostile the federal courts are to these programs. And whatever I might have thought before, I'm reasonably confident that our three newest justices will not be terribly supportive of any type of affirmative action program. And so that's the environment that we're operating under at this point. And so any agency that's going to undertake a race-conscious program really needs to meet the constitutional standard that the federal courts have imposed upon us. And that is that the agency has to be able to prove that it has a strong basis in evidence that race and gender based barriers are current, present, and are impacting the ability of firms to have full and fair opportunities to compete for the agency's contracts and subcontracts. This is called strict constitutional scrutiny. It is the highest level of review that a court can apply, and it applies both to programs designed to injure or discriminate against the victims of historic discrimination, as well as programs designed to ameliorate that discrimination. The government has to prove that it would be a passive participant in a discriminatory marketplace if it does not take some type of affirmative remedial steps to intervene. This is not an easy thing to prove, but it is possible. I'm happy to say I haven't lost a case yet, but it is just a very, very difficult standard to meet. The other thing to know is that any program that you adopt has to be narrowly tailored to the evidence that you present. And that evidence is usually presented via a disparity study. Overall population is irrelevant to the courts. So you could have a jurisdiction that was, I don't know, 70% Black and brown and people of color, but the courts don't care. What they want to know is what firms are available today that could do the work for the agency. So that's a very important limitation on what the city can do, is to have to meet that test. Also important to know that societal discrimination is not enough. For over 30 years, we've been kind of struggling with what the Supreme Court meant in the Croson case by that. But I think what we've come to think it means is that evidence of, for example, discrimination in housing or employment or unequal application of the criminal justice system, all of that type of information is simply not relevant, really, in the disparity study, because what the court is looking at is business opportunities. It's also important that all the groups that you want to include in your program must have suffered discrimination in your local marketplace. Some local programs for cities have been partially struck down because the agency didn't have what the court believed to be sufficient evidence of discrimination against that group. And so I'll just give you a quick example, one that continues to astonish me after all these years. But the City of Houston's program was held unconstitutional in part because it included Native Americans. And the disparity study that they had, which, full disclosure, I did participate in that, simply didn't have enough observations to be able to say anything sensible from a quantitative or statistical point of view. But the trial judge determined that we had to have quantitative evidence of discrimination against Indigenous people in order to have a program. And so they were, in fact, struck from the program. Let's see, a couple other things. Your program must, in fact, be limited to firms that are small and that are owned by persons who are economically disadvantaged. This is sometimes called the personal net worth test. The courts seem very concerned about whether, quote unquote, rich minorities are participating in the program. And so some type of economic disadvantage test, I think, is going to be required, and agencies' programs have been struck down for failure to do that. The firms must be small. We can have a conversation about how to define that. But again, the courts are very concerned about whether or not large minority firms would be hoovering up all the work. Your remedies must be flexible. Quotas are not permitted. Set-asides on the basis of race are not permitted. I just think there's no question that an agency that does that and is challenged is going to lose. Importantly, the agency must seriously consider race and gender neutral policies or measures, which is one reason why I wanted to start with that definition slide. You don't have to try them all and have them all fail, but you do have to be serious about them. And this is important also because these are the types of approaches that can really help firms to obtain prime contracts. Now, these programs are not subcontracting programs. I always want to stress that. You want to include all of the dollars in the contract, in your program and in your goal setting. But most of the participation is going to come through subcontracting. So when it comes to supporting prime contracting opportunities, those types of race and gender neutral measures are very important. And lastly, you have to have some type of sunset provision. Again, the courts are very concerned that these programs will go on and on and on. And so some type of date by which the agency will review the evidence upon which it relies really is an important part of a program. Certainly, without a disparity study, the only thing that an agency really can do that it would be race conscious would be to have some type of aspirational goals that you could set for your overall procurement, that you could ask departments or bureaus to try to achieve, but setting goals on contracts and insisting that people either meet them or demonstrate they made a good faith effort to do so simply is not going to be supportable without a study. So this is an important sort of limitation, I think, on what it is the city really can do at this point. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about best practices. And I was provided with lots of things to review for the city and very comprehensive. So thank you to Kathleen and her team for that. But I thought it was useful to sort of walk through what some of the initiatives or measures that you might consider are and sort of where they fall on this race and gender neutral matrix versus race and gender conscious. And so again, some of them are very, very important. So this graphic illustrates that point, and the city already has a number of programs in this area, although at least in my judgment, I think that there's certainly some room for expansion and improvement overall. Critically important, certainly want to stress the need for gathering data. I've been following the earlier discussion about the need to have disaggregated information to guide decision making, and that's very important. You do have the B2G Now system, so you're a long way ahead of a lot of my clients who are still doing things in spreadsheet or having help us on sticky notes. You see there are things like breaking up large contracts under contract procurement. This can be very important to the extent that it is feasible. Sometimes it's not. Making sure, for example, that the city pays promptly. That is actually the very first question I ask any new client. What's your net turnaround time on payments? Because if that's delayed, then the rest of this really doesn't matter. And I have some examples I could share if you like of where agencies have actually bankrupted small minority contractors because of the failure to pay on time. So that's really very important. Things like technical assistance programs to help people learn to do business with the city, as well as grow their capacities to work for other clients, is also very, very important. So next slide, please. So within that framework, what are some opportunities for improvement? And I recognize that some of these take more resources than others. Some of them take more time, but I thought I would at least share with you what I've been sharing with your internal team about some things I think that you might want to do. Certainly one possibility is to establish a division that oversees all the social equity and contracting programs. My sense of it is that Portland's procurement is pretty decentralized, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But when it comes to contracting and business diversity efforts, it can be helpful to have all of those functions housed in one division or department. And that's certainly, I think, what you see around the country in the programs that are more successful. It increases cooperation and coordination. I was interested in the council members, commissioners' comments about goods and services. That can be a particularly difficult one to kind of rope in for lots of reasons, which I'm happy to go into if you like. But to some extent, bringing it all together under one unit, I think has some real advantages to you. Making sure that you have staff in every bureau that are actually responsible for these efforts, these programs, that can be held accountable, that can be the point of contact or the liaison with other bureaus, with firms, is also, I think, a very important thing that you might want to think about. And it makes it clear that responsibility to ensure social equity and contracting is everyone's responsibility. It isn't just the procurement functions. It really is a citywide value and effort, and is treated as such. So I think that can be important. One thing you may want to think about is expanding the program to all industries. The focus has been on construction. That's actually quite common. It's obviously a large portion of your spend. It's where there are opportunities for subcontracting, unlike some industries that just don't run on that model. And historically, that's where the program started. It started out actually in highway contracts. But I think you have the opportunity to think about expanding it beyond that, to ensure that you are getting participation and ensuring equal opportunity for all different types of contracts. Along with that would mean entering all of your data into your contract management system. If you ever were to conduct a new disparity study, that would be a critical piece of both streamlining the study process and, importantly, reducing your costs, would be to have departments all start to be entering information into that system. Turning to supportive services, you do have a lot of programs. That was true, and there was that slide that I think made that very, very clear. And maybe that might be something to think about, is how to pull those all together into a really robust supportive services program. And an important element of that can be a bonding and financing program. I've interviewed easily a couple thousand minority-owned firms in my career, and many of them raise the issue of access to capital, access to surety bonding if they're in the construction industry. These are the types of barriers that, despite the city's best intentions, if people can't get access to cash, if they can't bond, then they can't bid, and they just can't participate. So there are a couple of good programs around the country. We don't do them, but I'm certainly happy to provide that information to the city. You might also think about, and I think we mentioned this a little bit, is focusing on prime contract awards, especially in industries that don't run on a prime submodel like most professional services. You can ensure that certified firms are always solicited for your informal procurements. I think someone mentioned the phrase low-hanging fruit. That's pretty low-hanging. Do count prime participation towards meeting the goals. There's really no reason not to, and that would be another way to assist minority and women-owned firms to do prime work, is not forcing them to subcontract. And certainly reviewing things like your pre-qualification, insurance, experience requirements, all of that I think is an important part of moving your program forward. And then just a couple of other things quickly. I suggest some revisions to the prime contractor development program, and we can talk in detail about that if somebody likes. Developing an annual bid forecast. This can be very helpful to firms so that they can plan their work. If they see that major projects are coming up, they can solicit partners to team with. But if everything gets dropped on people and there's 3 weeks to put the proposal or the team together, small firms often just cannot respond that quickly, that they just can't be that nimble. So a procurement forecast can be, I think, very helpful. I'd suggest to increase your outreach to MWBEs. An integrated electronic notification system is very helpful so that folks can find out about opportunities as they are put on the street, making sure that you can find everything you need on the website, facilitating prime contractor and certified subcontractor interaction through matchmaking and these kind of speed dating things. They're different formats to use, but certainly all of that is useful. And then last is to maybe think about whether or not you want to do a disparity study going forward. So I think that's all my slides. I don't know if anyone has any questions or want to save them to the end.
Commissioner Hardesty has a question, and then the mayor. Commissioner Hardesty?
Thank you for that presentation. I just wanted to, for the sake of my newer colleagues, less than 20% of firms are state certified. And so what we as a city do is we over and over again tap that 20% of minority firms that jump through all the hoops to help white prime contractors get additional points so they can get the contract. But it absolutely does nothing to build organizations led by people of color or women-owned firms. And so what is your advice when 20% of the people who actually have a business license are state certified? How do we ever get the other 80% to have an opportunity with the city of Portland?
Well, I think certainly one thing to explore, and I don't know whether this is happening or not, would be to develop some type of an outreach campaign or effort with the state so that firms that you may be able to identify or that have worked in airport contracts, for example, that may be DBE certified, but to go out into the community and engage people to try to become certified.
Why?
The courts, I'm sorry?
There's no benefit to people of color-owned businesses. The only benefit is for the white majority firms that use them as subcontractors. There's no benefit at all for people of color to jump through all those hoops to get a state certification.
Well, certainly one of the things that I would urge you to think about is to change the policy of only counting minority and women-owned firms towards subcontracting dollars. To be honest, that's actually pretty unusual to limit the ability of minority and women firms that are primes to count their own participation towards meeting goals. So that might be something that would assist. But I see I can see you shaking your head. Was that kind of not what you were thinking of? I think you're muted, Commissioner.
No, I was done. The mayor was next.
Okay.
Thanks, Ms. Holt, for testifying here today. This is actually very helpful, and I appreciate the framework. A couple of brief questions. Number one, as you can tell, part of the problem or the dialogue, maybe I shouldn't call it a problem, part of the opportunity, and by the way, I appreciate you headlining this as opportunities for improvement. It's nice to take a positive step here, is data. To make sure we're all talking about the same thing at the same time. And we look at the outcomes at the end, and we're pretty good at collecting that data. What percentage of contracts go to people of color, what percentage go to women. And we've heard from our procurement folks that they further disaggregate that data within the different categories. But that doesn't tell the whole story. And what you have hinted at is there's a front side of the story as well. And part of that, you mentioned capacity building. And so I have a twin program. The first is, how do we improve the data collection on the front end, particularly disaggregated data, when we understand a lot of the data we're collecting is responsive to state requirements? And then the second question is, when you mention capacity building, what are you talking about specifically? And what kind of programs have you seen that you think are particularly successful around capacity building?
Sure. And maybe I'll start with the first one, because I'm not exactly following what you mean about data on the front end. My understanding, and I could not be right about this, but my understanding is that the city is requiring, at least on the construction side, contractors to submit their list of subcontractors, telling the race, gender, and the industry codes that those contractors are in, and then tracking that during the performance of the contract. So maybe I'm not quite following what you meant on the front end.
Let me flesh this out a bit. I didn't do a very good job of it. So we get regular data from procurement on the nature of our city governance structures, that the city council actually approves virtually every significant contract, and we get the data that comes in, and oftentimes we don't meet our own aspirational goals. And the assumption is we failed because we did not meet the aspirational goals. But we don't I think, provide enough data on the front end. In other words, how many firms are there that actually could do the work?
Mm-hmm.
How many are close to being able to do the work and with some capacity building or additional support could actually be competitive in this process? And what do we know about the workforce pipeline in terms of who is ready and able to work on some of these projects? I feel that sometimes when we simply get the data at the end that says 14% compliance or 14% inclusion, that doesn't tell me the whole story. Is that all of the firms that were available? Was it 1/10 of the firms that were available? Is it 100th of the firms that were available? That would really help me to say whether or not we're doing a good job or not doing a good job. So I'm wondering if you could steer us towards a good set of metrics that perhaps other jurisdictions use that help tell that story a little more clearly, so that on the back end, when we're asked to approve a contract and we're just seeing the final participation number, it gives us the context of what happened previously. So that's part of my question. The second part you hinted at earlier, which was how do we take some of the subs and make them contractors? How do we make them the general contractor? And on the capital construction side, how do you make the GC the developer? That's really where the money is.
Yeah.
And so how do we act, can you steer us towards some really successful programs about not just technical assistance? We do that. We're good at technical assistance, but how do we actually support, or how should we, or what are the best practices you'd point us to around capacity building, both on the contractor side as well as on the workforce development side?
Well, let me just be clear that workforce is not my deep expertise. We really focus on contracting. I know something about it, but just want to be clear about what it is I know.
I have a feeling you've forgotten more than I ever knew on this subject.
Well, that might be true. I've been doing it for 30 years, so you don't look young enough to have been doing that. You're too young to be able to do that.
Oh, please, can you just say that a few more times? That's perfect.
But as to the availability question, it's actually much more complicated than it sounds. There really is no place to go to easily find out, let's just make up something. What's the availability of concrete firms that are owned by women and minorities, let alone broken out by race? That really is a primary function of a disparity study, is that availability piece. And sometimes agencies will do an availability analysis without all the other pieces that go along with the disparity study. But there isn't any easy place to go find that. And so I think that might be something the city might want to think about is maybe instead of a full dress disparity study, might be some type of availability analysis. Because right now, nobody can tell you what is the availability of a certain group to work on any particular contract. And just recognize that that's always a moving target anyway, because today I've got a new project, I can't bid, tomorrow I'm done. So it's always a little bit not real time, but there's not an easy source to be able to do that. I mean, one thing that you may want to do if you're not is collecting data on the basis of race by bidders. I just don't know whether the city is doing that or not. I do think that moving to a policy that allows certified firms to count their own participation as primes will help increase your bidder pool of those firms. Because when you have to give work away to another firm, it just impacts your profitability, your management costs, everything. So that is one way to think about it, is to see who's bidding your work, how successful are they? If we find out that 20% of your bidders are minority-owned firms, but they only win 2% of the contracts, well, that's useful information. And then you could take a dive into asking people why. On the capacity building side, there are some things that are out there that I think are useful. There are a couple of really good bonding programs. And the key there is that for firms that go through the program, you have a surety and a lender that have agreed to work with that firm. There are lots of bonding education programs out there. U.S. Department of Transportation has had one for at least 20 years, but they're kind of like a makeover, but you don't have a date. So the good programs bring you a date. You might not get married, but you at least got a date. San Francisco has been running one for a while. So I can certainly get some context. Again, we don't do that, but there are some good firms out there. And the key is to have all the players that you need to succeed, which is a step beyond education. A couple other things to think about. There are some agencies have been pretty successful with linked deposit type programs where the city's depository institutions agree that a small firm could use its contract as collateral. That does require the law department to be on board because most government contracts are not assignable. So there's some things you could do kind of along those lines. I think that would help. There are some other revolving loan programs that are out there. But I just have to say there's no magic answer or silver bullet for any of this. I mean, every agency across the country at every level of government is struggling with this. How to get firms, make sure you pay on time. I don't know. But those are all the kinds of things I think could help you. But there are some models out there that the city could take a look at.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I see Nate has put something in the chat here about what you're referring to, bonding programs as well as insurance support programs and the like.
Oh, actually, that's one of the programs I'm talking about is Meriwether and Lewis. So thank you, Nate. Hi, Nate, for that. That's definitely one that I would recommend that you check out.
Excellent. Thanks. Appreciate it very much. Thank you again for being here.
Okay, it looks like Commissioner Rubio has a question.
Hey, thank you, Colette, for all your information. I have a couple of questions. I've also been hearing of late a lot of the barriers to even become certified by immigrant-owned firms. So I wanted to ask you about that. Do you have any good examples where a program has worked and either remove these barriers or address them, or how are other cities handling these barriers? And then also, have you seen any examples where a city develops its own certification to remove barriers and make it more accessible for a lot of these firms to be successful proposers?
Well, and as to the immigrant issue, I have to tell you, I haven't seen anybody particularly even focusing on it. I do know that there's some programs that have some language support, but that's kind of about it. I really can't give you an example of anybody that's particularly been going into immigrant communities per se, and working with people to get them certified. But I can certainly, if you're interested, I can certainly ask around. But I actually haven't seen that. In terms of a city doing its own certification, well, yes. I mean, many cities do that. Chicago, Houston, Cleveland. I mean, I can name you some more. City of Austin, Seattle, right? That were already up on your slides. Do in fact do their own certifications. But a caveat about this. Certification is burdensome because the courts require it to be, regardless of what agency is doing it. The federal courts are been very, very, I'm not even sure where I want to use, maybe hostile, whatever. But you've got to prove your minority status. You must prove that your firm is small. You must prove that you meet the personal net worth test, that you have some experience. And so certification is burdensome, but it's not really driven by what agency's doing it. It's driven by the legal standards that are required. And I certainly have plenty of sympathy, for firms. I mean, at one point, our firm was certified in 17 states. So I get it. But I also know that the courts are going to require that level of intensity and review. And then, of course, there's just sort of the practical problem that nobody wants to be on the front page of the paper with a bunch of front firms. One thing I can say is that in the last, I don't know, call it maybe 10 years or so, we seem to have a lot fewer problems with front firms. And by fronts, I mean firms that are not legitimately owned, managed, and controlled by the minority or woman owner. I think a lot of agencies have really tightened that up. But tightening it up increases the burdens on people to some extent. You've got to do site visits. You've got to review their financials. I want your tax returns. It just can't be skipped, most of it. So I'm not so sure that the city doing it would make it any less burdensome because the legal standards aren't going to change. but certainly plenty of cities do it themselves too. So that's actually pretty common, but it's a very, very intensive, expensive undertaking, which doesn't mean that Portland shouldn't do it, but just understand that you're going to need several FTEs to be able to carry that function out properly.
Right. Thank you, Colette. I am
That's
going.
Michelle telling us to move on.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine.
Yeah, we have 20 minutes left to go. And Kathleen Massier, I'm afraid I'm going to cut your one slide. It's in the PowerPoint, and we can provide background to everyone. I apologize. Judith, I will quickly introduce the three community members who joined us today. And we chatted in between, and you are okay with me doing that just to save a quick moment from having to turn it over to you. So at this time, I'm going to ask our first of three community advisors to come on board, and that is Connie Ashbrook, who is with the Community Equity and Inclusion Committee. And Connie, are you, there she is, okay. I'm gonna ask you for just a brief, just a couple minutes, and we would love to hear from you. Thank you so much. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Michelle. Good afternoon, Mayor and Council members. I will keep this brief. I'll keep my comments to less than 2 minutes. And thank you so much, Mayor and Council members, for your service to the city and your attention to increasing equity through the city's social equity and contracting programs. As many of you know, I have been following the city's workforce equity program since 1996, when Mayor Katz appointed me to the Mayor's Fair Contracting Forum. And I also worked in construction myself for 17 years, went on to start and run Oregon Tradeswomen, served on the State Apprenticeship Council and the Federal Advisory Committee on Registered Apprenticeship. And so using that expertise on workforce, I have some recommendations for council, really focused on the workforce side of your efforts, but also a few comments on the contracting side. I do want to just bring forward what you know and many others have said, that the reason we are having this conversation is because of many years of sexist and racist policies that have previously been put in place and have had a lasting impact on our culture and systems that you are now in position to remedy. And so thank you for your passion for putting those remedies in place. The city has a very effective anti-poverty and equity building tool in its procurement policies. It's worthy of devoting the council time and your time to understanding its use, supporting procurement staff, and making sure your bureaus know that you want them to be collaborative with procurement and support procurement's equity goals. I and other CEIC members appreciate working with Kathleen Brenes-Marua. She is solutions-based and is leading the reorganization of procurement to be more effective and engage teams and bureaus in equity performance. I want to emphasize the importance of the workforce component of contracting. For myself and many others, working in construction has been a huge boost out of poverty. Also, the city can grow a larger pool of minority contractors by a focus on workforce. About 75% of minority contractors got their start as trades workers before they opened their own business, and of using the skills that they learned as trades workers to be successful business owners. Procurement's equity charge needs council help to be most effective. Please direct the heads of the bureaus you lead to give procurement support and embed equity performance and contracting in the performance reviews of their teams. Procurement needs a large enough team to fulfill council's expectations, and they need follow-up funding to implement the recommendations of the audit. Procurement and bureaus, especially project managers, need to educate contractors on equity expectations as part of bid openings, bid selection, project management, and be part of holding contractors accountable. Solid upfront equity plans from contractors before ground is broken will make sure that equity goals will be met. Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty, for your emphasis on disaggregated data and on results. Thank you, Commissioner Mapps. You made a good point in looking at an equity approach to goods and services. For instance, in HVAC maintenance contracts, you could definitely impact equity and diversity there. The Community Equity and Inclusion Committee has seen the difference between a contractor that has to be prodded and coaxed to even do the bare minimum towards equity versus a contractor that sees it as part of their job and hires experts to make sure it happens for their projects. Procurement needs a stronger menu of penalties for contractors who are not performing in their equity commitments and goals. Finally, we need a way to recognize and reward contractors who perform on both contracting and workforce equity. Thank you again for your time and commitment to social equity in contracting. I don't think we have time for follow-up questions now, but I would be happy to answer any follow-up questions you might have or anything questions you might direct to me in the future. Thank you very much.
Commissioner Hardesty, did you have your hand? I'm sorry, Commissioner Rubio, did you have your hand raised?
No, I'm sorry. I just forgot to lower it.
All right, great. Thank you. Then I'm going to move on to Mr. Art Cortez, who is a contractor, and he is with Latino Built. There he is. It's all yours.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Mayor Wheeler and council members for inviting me to speak today. I'm Art Cortez. I'm co-owner of 3 companies. I'm speaking mostly on behalf of Latino Built, Associated Wall and Ceiling, Art Cortez Construction, and the Harbor Company. I've been in the construction industry for 36 years. I'm one of the CIC members. I'm glad to be a member, and thank you for allowing me to be there. I want to point out the CIC has 2 active contractors sitting at the table, and I'm one Latino contractor, and Maurice is an African-American. Contractors need to be involved in policy making and with the city so that there's an even flow of understanding once we work with the community. That's my message to the council members. My report to you is about our activities with the 2 primes that are actually under a CIC contract. One is really easy to work with, does very well, wants to meet all the expectations of the equity programs built into the contract. And we have another one that's not so easy to work with and struggles to follow up or meet all the expectations that we have on them. Our assessment is mostly that contractor had signed a contract early when the CIC statements were written in and it wasn't really spelled out, which has led to a lot of extra communication with Kathleen and the city attorney and project managers that want to help us work with that contractor. I also want to state that the committee has a lot of interest in pursuing penalties. My view is that we need to find ways that penalties aren't the solution. It's actually the project being successful with the true equity goals being met. I would suggest that the roles of the committee to focus on and creating a great relationship with primes doing business with the city of Portland. what I would like to emphasize is that we should work and move forward and create a better understanding between prime relationships with the city and prime understanding contracts with the city, primes to subs, and the support of equity goals. Primes ask subs to hire minority subs, and sub tier understanding, which is confusing at times. And sub tier ability to self fund is a huge issue. And city's ability to help support minority subs, which we know there's some programs at play. There's much more to talk about, and I wish the city to consider funds to support the CIC. Then stress on all projects that we meet the equity goals that are required. As I want to speak for the group, I really want to stress the level that minority subs usually get into trouble on projects, and they need help, and they're mostly embarrassed to ask for help. So we need to be very clear about how we can create that ease of information and allow them to prosper and be a part of the community, and not just be a choice for work. Anyway, my name's Art Cortez. I thank you for your time and me being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Art. And our third speaker in this section is Mr. Nate McCoy. And there is Nate. And Nate, if you could keep your remarks to just a couple minutes, but we'd love to hear from you. So thank you for joining us today.
And thank you. I'm happy to be here today on behalf of NAMAC Oregon. We'd like to thank you, Mayor and City Commissioners, for allowing us to be in this meaningful conversation today. And for the record, as I said, Nate McCoy, Executive Director. And I want to also acknowledge, I also serve as the chair for the Portland Housing Advisory Commission, as well as the Fair Contracting Forum and other equity initiatives around contracting for the city. And why it's important, this discussion today, is that the city has direct impact on the economic and social well-being of Portlanders. And as it was mentioned earlier, in particular, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian communities in response. The COVID crisis, and I did not hear that today, but the COVID crisis and the social unrest has completely taken the community backwards and deepened economic inequity and the recovery and contracting opportunities. And I feel like this city leadership has and must be accountable to closing the gap on the economic and racial justice through these policies, these processes, and these projects. And that's a clear commitment I'm hearing today from the commissioners. And this is an inequity of economic development that exists in housing, transportation, jobs, workforce development, small business support. This is everything that our city of Portland does and can do better. And I think the city leadership that we have here today seems to be very clear on uplifting and empowering these resolutions. And NAMAC, alongside our other equity stakeholders, feel like those closest to the problem are certainly closest to the solution. And as Colette Holt said earlier, we have to be more intentional on how we build capacity. The Prime Contractor Development Program was a great program. The program needs to be enhanced in a more inclusive and equitable way to live up to all the outcomes and goals I think the city is aspiring to see. And then last but not least, I want to also mention that given that that link I put in the chat, we've already brought some of these seasoned vets to the city actually last year, or actually 2 years ago, to meet with city staff, the then chief procurement officer for City of Portland, Metro, ODOT, and Port of Portland. So when we think about this robust program, let's not think about it narrowly focused to just the City of Portland. Let's think about how our regional partners and our agencies can buy into a system that really should be built from the whole built environment, not just what the city puts in, but from all of its partners regionally, because there is way too much work coming. And as Art said, we need to get contractors ready and get those relationships built. And some of it is in the prime contractor side. Some of these contractors want to control their own destiny. They don't want to be subs to a larger GC. So I want to make sure that we're on record that we want to hold these systems, these tracking mechanisms, and the great procurement staff that is trying to do the work. We need to hold all of ourselves more accountable. Because if we have a good plan without any resources or any, money allocations, it's hard to achieve the goals and outcomes that we want to see today. So again, I appreciate being here and having the invite. I don't know if we have time for questions, but there was a lot I heard that NAMAC would love to lean in at a later date. So thank you.
Thanks for being here, Nate. Good to see your face, even just virtually. Appreciate it. For the record, I'm Tom Reinhardt. I'm the Chief Administrative Officer, and I get the challenging task of trying to bring this complex and important work session home in 6 minutes. So if the team could just put up the final slide, we're going to skip a bunch of slides. I'm going to do my best to kind of recap the notes I took in my little book here. And for the new commissioners, I carry this with me everywhere. Commissioner Hardesty and Mayor Wheeler have seen this a lot. New commissioners have not. So I've got some notes in my little book. Paul, could you put up, or Jenny, could you put up the final slide? Oh, I see Commissioner Maps has a much bigger book. Of course. Yeah. See, okay. Yeah. Commissioners have taken more notes. Okay.
Tom, I think it's important that you note that we're also taking notes about you as you're taking notes about us. And I think Commissioner Mapp's book already looks pretty full there.
Noted. So Paul or Jenny, could you put up the final slide that in my section, please? I just want to do a quick overview, and then we will plan follow-up. I don't want to hear from everybody if I mostly captured this and what I'm missing. Paul or Jenny, okay, thank you. Sorry about that. So the final, I think it's 32 in the section. Yeah, okay, thank you. Appreciate you being on your toes. So we heard loudly and clearly, I believe, that the 12 different programs and the complexity and the layering of programs on the procurement services division is too much and doesn't make sense for what we're trying to accomplish, and that the council confirms our suspicion that we've had since the audit that we should work very hard on kind of updating, consolidating, making it more coherent, like how all these programs work in concert with one another or not, and to have a holistic approach to the program. So I think that's one of the things that we heard. There was interest in the goods and services spend. And even though Ms. Holt cautioned us that would be difficult, it sounds like there's momentum and interest in council for a way to tackle that. So, okay, I'm seeing some head nods. Commissioner Hardesty was very clear around, even in a high level briefing like today, we should always present disaggregated data. Paul's going to put in the chat the link to disaggregated data, but we will learn and relearn that, and we will do that. And we heard that, and I think others are in agreement on that. We also heard from Commissioner Rubio an interest in what we can do on immigrant outreach, and that historically we have not thought about that as a specific component of outreach. I think we should do more discussion about how we would do that well. So I heard that. And then there was enough of this of many different complex things swirling around that reminded me that in my section I was going to talk about, I've decided to assign a project lead for all of this and not just have, procurement in the day-to-day crunch on their capacity issues, trying to interface with council offices and policymakers and council members themselves and community members, but to actually think of the audit implementation and these ideas from council as, an annual project that we need to do, and we need a talented person running it and reporting to you on it and driving it. And that has been an omission on my part in the last 18 months. So that is not on the procurement team, that is on me. And I think that's learning that I am taking from today, that we really need to just have somebody tracking these changes and helping the teams work their way through them. What did I miss there? What did I not put in the review that is not captured in my little notebook?
Are you waiting for me to just jump in?
Yeah. Anybody?
Somebody to say "Mother, may I" or something. Thank you, Tom. I think you did an incredible job of actually listening to all of us. It occurs to me the first step should be we don't need 12 programs because clearly if we're getting the kind of minimal results that we're getting, having 12 programs is doing nothing to improve that. So I would really like to see those programs, some of them go away. I'd like to see some analysis about how we're going to collapse these programs so that we have more intentionality around how we do these programs. And like Commissioner Mapps, I was struck by the amount of money we spend in goods and services and the fact that we've never once actually figured out how we could actually make those dollars available to minority and women owned firms. And so I think you listened very well. But for me, it's like 12 programs are too much, way too much, especially with the outcomes that we get. So I would really like to know, how are we going to either do away with them, collapse, or something so that it's much more manageable. We couldn't even tell the public what programs we have to support minority and women-owned businesses. So there's no way the public would find it on its own.
Thank you.
I would also just add, I just want to make a clarification. It's about my questions about immigrants, contractors. It's not just outreach, it's actually removing systemic barriers to becoming certified, because the outreach isn't working, just simply outreach. And that's a distinction for me. And then the other thing, we didn't get a chance to talk about it, but I am really interested in exploring, looking at the impact of the alternative procurement processes, and then how that's going, and how can we actually expand that to not be called alternative, but actually be one of the primary ways that we engage in this, because we do get best value out of those processes, or that's what we're hearing anecdotally, as so far on these things. And then also, I am really interested in one of the recommendations by Colette, which was to really capacitate all bureaus to actually have that capacity. So way upstream, and not waiting until it gets downstream into procurement, and about and the cookies are half baked already, but really just at the conception end, with the bureaus, when you're putting these concepts together and you're making the decision whether to go for alternative or something else, that you're actually considering all options, and you're building it inclusively, and then the end product will be better. So those are just a few things I want to offer.
Thank you.
Looks like the mayor is waiting to jump in, but
yeah, please. I'm sorry, I can't see the hand. Go ahead.
Carmen made me think of something else as we're talking about the alternative procurement. There's a cost to not having contracts available for women and people of color. So when we're talking about like the lowest responsible bidder, there is a cost associated with people losing opportunity for these contracts, right? So we say we have to do it because we have to take the lowest responsible bidder. But what is the cost? What is the economic cost of women and people of color business owners not being able to obtain public contracts, right? Not being able to build their businesses. So we have to be able to tell both stories and not default to either the federal government won't let us, the state won't let us, or I will say we have to fall to the lowest responsible bidder. I really hope procurement is thinking big. And unfortunately today, I didn't see any big thinking. But I'm hopeful that as we go back and reflect, that we're really thinking about these are the barriers that have been in place for my 32 years that I've been working on this, right? And so the bonding, the insurance, the minority businesses have asked for that for 32 years, and we've done no action on it, right? So I want to excuse myself, or apologize for my frustration, because we've had these conversations a lot, and I felt like we came in here like starting as if we've had no experience with this.
Yeah, we hear you, Commissioner. Yeah, go ahead, Mayor.
Yeah, let me jump in, because I think my comments are related to both Commissioner Hardesty's as well as Commissioner Rubio's. First of all, I want to thank procurement for putting this presentation together. The purpose of it was to generate thought and discussion, and it certainly has done that. And I'm in agreement with Commissioner Hardesty. I feel like there is some I won't call it low-hanging fruit. There's no easy solution here, but there are some solutions that are more obvious than others. And we've heard from Colette and others that the bonding piece is one that's done routinely elsewhere, and that it's been on the to-do list for many, many years. I would like the Bureau to make a proposal to us. It shouldn't just be the City Council looking at this and trying to figure out where the gaps are. You are the professionals who collectively know where these gaps are too. Maybe make some recommendations to us about some of where you see the obvious next steps being. I like the suggestion Commissioner Hardesty put on the table around insurance. It shouldn't be a major impediment to a firm to be able to qualify for one of these programs because they're struggling to get the insurance. That's the kind of infrastructure that the city should be able to, if not provide, then at least provide support or connections or contacts, or we have a relationship with a certain number of insurers that know who we are and is willing to work with our clients in order to make them successful participants in our minority contracting program. I was a little reluctant to jump onto Commissioner Mapp's bandwagon about the complexity of the problem, just because I know it's the council who ultimately created all of these programs. And every time a gap gets identified, the council jumps in and creates a new program. And then it reaches some capacity where councils then say, oh my God, this is so complex, nobody can figure it out. Let's simplify it. And so then it starts going, so it becomes this accordion thing. And I'm sure if you go back and look at the history of council decisions, you'll see that. So maybe the question isn't so much what do we get rid of, but as Colette had suggested, maybe there's a way to streamline this. I think she used the word robust. She was hinting at us several times. Make it effective, streamlined, and matter. And so if maybe with that information, if the Bureau could go back and maybe do some thinking and come back to us with a couple of ideas on how that might look, I think that'd be really useful. Yeah, to both Mayor and Commissioner Harcy's points, because we got crunched on time, we weren't able to outline some of the ideas. The Bureau does have ideas. This helps confirm many of them in terms of your comments. And it pushes us further, which is exactly what you should do as our council. I would propose that we do put together a full proposal on next steps for you, and we'll just work it through you and your teams if that's acceptable to the council. Yeah, good. And again, I want to thank Kathleen for jumping into the fray here. She did this as a favor to serve as an interim, and we're all very passionate about this subject. And I honestly, as I was listening to her speak, I thought she must have a background as a school teacher. She's very patient, she's very thoughtful, and she's pulling all of our ideas together. And I want to applaud her and the entire team. I'm sorry, colleagues, we ran over as we feared we might. I want to be respectful of everybody's position. But Tom, could you give us a few more sentences about what's next and where this leads? Can you tie up the loose ends? Yes, and Michelle can help me if I leave anything out, but we do plan on doing a whole summary of next action items. And I wasn't able to do the slide of the work that the procurement division is currently doing in response to the audit, and it does cover some pieces of what the council has pushed for here. Good. So we will do that in a very short version. And what we'll do is Michelle and I, in our follow-up check-ins with all of you individually, will continue to dive into it. Perfect. Good. Anything else urgent, colleagues, before we call it? All right, we are adjourned. Thanks, everybody. Good session. Great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.